From the magical realms of the Greeks and the Norse mythology to the urban fantasies of today, fairies have captured our imagination. In this episode, we'll explore the evolution of fairies, their various incarnations, and how they've been used in literature, movies, and urban fantasy. We'll also take a closer look at the Irish fairy myths, specifically the She courts, and trace the journey of one particular fairy from her appearance to her role in modern fantasy. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worlds with your host, Marie Mullaney. If you enjoy what I do here, please do consider supporting this channel by joining for these exclusive member perks or giving this video a super thanks if you find value in it. And if you're looking for an epic fantasy series to dive into, don't forget to check out my series, Sangwheel Chronicles, available at multiple online bookstores. Okay, enough of that. Let's crack on. In Greek mythology, fairy-like creatures took various forms, often as nymphs, minor deities, or other supernatural beings. They typically inhabited the natural world and played different roles, both serving the gods and interacting with humans. Some of these beings in Greek mythology include nymphs, which were beautiful, immortal female spirits associated with specific natural locations such as forests, rivers, mountains, and so on. They were often considered the personification of creative and nurturing aspects of nature. There are different kinds of nymphs, such as the dryads, the naiads, and the oceanids. Nymphs often served and accompanied the gods in various capacities. For example, naiads served Poseidon, and oceanids were the daughters of the Titan Oceanus, and so on. Nymphs were typically female and had male counterparts, the satyrs and the seleni, which were male nature spirits that typically, tried to catch nymphs and, let's be polite and call it make out with them. Satyrs and seleni were typically with Dionysus, with whom they would party all night long, drinking wine and chasing nymphs. So this kind of aspect of delving into nature spirits was very typical of all human societies. And just to prove my point, let's take a look at the Japanese culture of these natural spirits in the Japanese world. Japanese nature spirits typically could serve as protectors, as guides, as bringers of misfortune, depending on their nature and circumstances surrounding their interaction with humans. They were deeply intertwined with the natural world, representing the connection between humans, nature, and the spiritual realm. In both Greek and Japanese mythology, these creatures emphasize the importance of respecting and understanding the natural world and the forces that govern it. All kinds of fantasy world-building components have been drawn from these classical spirits of nature for their fairies, but the fairy tradition that is most often used for world building is probably the Irish mythology of the She, who are a supernatural race often equated with fairies or elves. They are believed to inhabit the other world, a parallel realm invisible to humans. The She are commonly associated with the Tuatha Dé Danann, a race of godlike beings in Irish mythology who later transformed into fairies. The Seelie and the Unseelie court are actually part of the Scottish fairy tradition, but they are often co-opted into the Irish Sea, with a Seelie court which is more benevolent and an Unseelie court which is more malevolent or mischievous. This duality reflects the inherent ambiguity of fairies in Celtic folklore, where they can be both helpful and harmful, depending on the circumstances and the specific fairy court encountered. The same duality can be seen in Norse mythology, where the concept of light and dark is represented through the distinction between the light elves and the dark elves or dwarves, the Svartalfar. The light elves are associated with beauty and goodness, while the dark elves or dwarves are linked to darkness and, in some instances, malevolence. This duality in Norse mythology echoes the division between the Seelie and the Unseelie court in Scottish folklore. So, looking at these traditions, it is pretty clear that every human culture has this underlying folklore of nature spirits of various sorts, and that's the base inspiration that we draw from when we're building fairies in fantasy worlds. But how did we go from nymphs and satyrs to Queen Mab looking after Hellboy? Let's now turn away from myth and folklore and talk about specific literary references. Fairies gained widespread popularity through the works of William Shakespeare, particularly in his play A Midsummer Night's Dream. Here we encounter the fairy king and queen Oberon and Titania, who meddle in the lives of humans, creating chaos and mischief. Shakespeare's portrayal of the fairies as whimsical and mischievous beings with their own complex social hierarchy and intrigues has had a lasting impact on how fairies are depicted in the literature and other forms of popular culture. Shakespeare was not alone in his interest in fairies and his depiction of them in literary works. A contemporary of Shakespeare, Edmund Spenser, also wrote about fairies. He penned an epic poem called The Fairy Queen, and it is an allegorical tale that draws on Arthurian legends, chivalric romance, and English folklores, with fairies playing a central role in the story. In Spenser's works, fairies are portrayed as noble and courtly beings who inhabit a mythical realm known as fairyland. They embody various virtues and vices and often interact with knights and other human characters on their quests. The titular character of the poem, the Fairy Queen, is a powerful and benevolent fairy monarch named Gloriana. She represents the ideal of virtue and embodies the qualities of grace, beauty, and wisdom. The other fairy characters in the poem are also associated with specific virtues, so each fairy in the poem kind of represents a virtue. So there is, for example, the Red Cross Knight, who represents holiness, and Britomart, who represents chastity. Spenser's work also features more malevolent fairy creatures, such as an enchantress and a shape-shifting monster. These antagonistic figures often serve as obstacles for the protagonists, testing their virtues and challenging them to overcome adversity. So if you take a look at these two contemporary poets of the time, Shakespeare and Spenser, you can already see how you have these differing interpretation of fairy courts and how our modern tale around fairies is starting to take place with different courts, one adversarial and one friendly and so on. But to really explore how fairies have evolved, we must talk about Queen Mab's journey, because she is one of the most enduring fairy characters in literature. She first appears in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet as a mischievous spirit. Mercutio has this long speech about her, and I won't repeat the whole thing here, but the core of it is this. She is depicted as a small, mischievous fairy who is the midwife of dreams. She is said to visit people in their sleep and bring them dreams, often reflecting their deepest desires or their fears. The dreams she brings can be both pleasant or disturbing, or pleasant and disturbing, depending on the nature of the dreamer. Now, that was Shakespeare's original vision, and we think he made it up out of whole cloth. But by 1627, the first adaptation of Queen Mab came from Michael Drayton's Nymphidia, the Court of Fairy. This was a narrative poem that provided a satirical take on the English court by presenting a parallel fairy world. The poem is set in a miniature fairy kingdom and features various characters, including a fairy king and queen, Oberon and Titania, and Queen Mab, who is a cunning and powerful fairy who has a rivalry with Oberon and Titania. This rivalry forms a major part of the poem's narrative, adding drama and intrigue to the story. One of the defining characteristics of Queen Mab in Nymphidia is her involvement in romantic entanglements of the fairy court. She is described as nimble-witted, a fairy who often manipulates the emotions of other characters to achieve her ends. This is probably building on Shakespeare's description of her as the fairy's midwife, hence her connection with the emotional world. But we can already see here that there are some darker elements coming into Queen Mab's personality. Now, those darker elements were eliminated by Percy Shelley, who was very clearly inspired by Shakespeare when he wrote a poem in 1813 called Queen Mab, where she is portrayed as a powerful and benevolent figure who acts as a muse to humanity, guiding them towards a utopian future. This leans into Mab's aspects as a manipulator of dreams. Shelley presents her as a more enlightened and inspiring figure, a contrast to her original portrayal in Romeo and Juliet. Then we come to her Irishification by Samuel Lover in his The Legends and Stories of Ireland in 1831. In this work, Queen Mab is presented as a figure associated with Irish folklore who often grants wishes and blessings to those who encounter her. In this depiction, Queen Mab is a benevolent and whimsical character who plays an important role in the lives of Irish people. She is often described as a small, delicate creature with the ability to grant wishes, bestow blessings, and even transform the fortunes of those she comes across. Her presence in the stories adds an element of magic and wonder to the narratives, reflecting the rich and imaginative nature of Irish folklore. But the thing is, before Shakespeare, there was no reference to Queen Mab. There was a warrior queen called Maeve in Irish mythology, but she was nothing like the fairy Queen Mab. So honestly, I think Samuel Lover just adopted Mab from Shakespeare and turned her Irish. But you can see in his work with the granting of wishes and the small character and so on, how this is starting to lean into fairy traditions like Tinkerbell or small fairies that grant you wishes when you trap them in a circle or if you capture them. This is, I think, where that part of the mythology comes from, is this association of Queen Mab with Irish folklore of granting wishes. But there was another part of this adoption of Mab into Irish folklore. There was another element that was impacted by it. I think this adoption of Mab into the Irish folklore is why her personality shifted from whimsical and dream-based to colder and more manipulative. The 19th century saw a resurgence of interest in Irish folklore and mythology. In Irish traditions, fairies or she were often portrayed as capricious and unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous. As Queen Mab became more closely associated with the Irish folklore, her character absorbed some of these darker qualities. Now, in the early 20th century, she was not a very popular character, but all that changed with the advent of Hellboy in 1993. In Mike Mignolia's Hellboy comics, Queen Mab is reimagined as a darker, more mysterious character, departing from the whimsical and benevolent portrayals in earlier works. Here she is a powerful and influential figure within the world of fairies, often operating behind the scenes and manipulating events to suit her own interests. Mab's motives are often enigmatic, and she appears to have a complex agenda that may not always align with the goals of the other characters. She is portrayed as cunning, secretive, and not to be underestimated, making her a formidable figure in the Hellboy universe. Mignolia's Queen Mab is steeped in folklore and mythology of various cultures, blending elements of Irish and British fairy traditions with other supernatural beings and creatures. This creates a unique and compelling character that adds depth to the world of Hellboy. While Mab's role in the comics may not be as prominent as in some other works, her presence as a powerful force that influences the unfolding of events adds an air of mystery and intrigue to the story. This portrayal of Queen Mab as a darker and more manipulative character has helped to shape the modern urban fantasy genre and has influenced subsequent depictions of fairies and fairy queens in popular culture. And I think that Hellboy is why we got the slew of Ice Queen Mabs. Jim Butcher brought out the Dresden Files, the first book published in 2000, where Mab is the queen of the Winter Court, sinister, powerful, manipulative, and occasionally helpful to Harry Dresden. In Holly Black's Tithe, a modern fairy tale in 2002, she is a powerful and cruel figure in the Unseelie Court, involved in political machinations within the world of fairies. In Julie Kagawa's The Iron Fae series 2010 to 2013, she is a key figure in the Winter Court, possessing both beauty and cruelty involved in the power struggles between the Seelie and Unseelie courts. For me, Mab's journey, in a way, represents all of fairies' journey in fantasy. They started as nature spirits, our way to try and understand the world around us. Over time, that evolved into hidden worlds and strange magical beings that change as our societies change. For Shakespeare and his contemporaries, fairies were whimsical creatures, putting the ass ears on people and playing such pranks. The Romance poets saw fairies as wise and benevolent beings. And as they gave way to the dark and gritty interests of the Gothic-obsessed Victorians, fairies changed to darker beings. And in these days, fairies can be anything. They are a reflection of our own fears, our desires, the complexities of our human existence. And in your world, they can reflect the nature of your society, emphasizing the shape of the culture of your humans. And now I have a small confession to make. I have written a not safe for work novella under a pen name in a world that has a Queen Mab, and she looks like this. I made her an Earth Mage and a Queen of the Unseelie Court, and that book will be released on 1 June 2023. I will leave a link to my pen name in the video description so that you can follow that pen name on Amazon if you're interested in not safe for work fantasy content. Comes with a warning. When I say not safe for work, I mean not safe for work. But what about you? What Queen Mab will you create in your world? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out my video on using hidden worlds in fantasy. And if you found value in this video, please do give it a thumbs up and consider supporting the channel through memberships or super thanks. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World.